Before we get started on this episode of the Russophiles Unite movie podcast, I wanted to let you know about World Film Locations Moscow from Intellect Books, edited by Birgit Boimers. The book explores over 40 scenes spanning almost a century of Russian and Soviet movies that use the Russian capital as their backdrop, and that includes a piece on a scene from Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears, of course. It also features 7 short essays on topics ranging from the grandiose but never realised palace of the Soviets to the Moscow Metro. The latter was a very big part of my life in Moscow, and the former, well, it didn't exist, so, not so much. Anyway, this book is part of Intellect Books' wider World Film Locations series that encompasses New York, Paris, Buenos Aires, Tokyo, Mumbai, Dublin, Toronto. You get the picture. If it's a prominent location in world cinema, the chances are there's a book in the series about it. You'll be able to get hold of these from your nearest independent bookseller or wherever you get your books, and you can also find them at intellectbooks.com. I've included links to both the Moscow edition and the wider series in the show notes for this episode. Okay, so now that you know about that, on with the show.
Hear me.
Скажи мне, американец, в чем сила?
А вы что, собираетесь на ней жениться?
Да.
Ух, красота-то какая, лепота.
Таможня дает добро.
И вообще не называй меня, пожалуйста, Вероникой. Кто я? Вот кто я?
Отныне русской земле единый быть.
Don't torture me, I can't live without him.
Hi, my name's Ali. This is the Russophiles Unite podcast, where we watch Russian films or films about Russia. As always, I'm joined by a guest, and today my guest is Jenny. Hi, Jenny.
Hi there. Very nice to be here.
Thanks for coming along, although we're actually recording this in your house. So,
Indeed, yeah.
So me coming along, but never mind.
Thanks for hosting, Jenny. You've been awesome.
Yeah, indeed. Okay. Indeed. So, Jenny, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So, I work for a wildlife charity. I do PR for a very niche area of the RSPB that deals with investigating bird crime. So I'd spend most of my life writing about dead birds, which is weird. Before that, I wrote about other things that were a bit more normal, mostly theatre, books, restaurants and stuff for a local magazine and a local paper. So yeah, that's kind of me professionally, and I know Ali here from our university days when I was studying English literature, and he used to sneak into our film screenings because one of our modules was literature and film. So every week we'd have a different film shown in a lecture theatre, and yeah, he came along and we'd talk about the films and that kind of thing. And yeah, we've always had that interest in films and literature together.
Yeah, we've kind of been nerding it up about films and books for quite some time now.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind
Over
of scary.
10 years.
Yes, it's now going to be 10 years since we graduated this summer, which is...
terrifying.
It is terrifying. So speaking of films and cinema, what would you say your kind of taste in films is? What films do you like?
My favourite films are pretty much the same as when I was about 14. So I think that's the age when I decided what I liked, and I haven't really changed since then. So, I don't have a cool sense of taste in films, but I think my all-time favourite is Little Women, which I just absolutely love, and I can watch that at any stage in my life and relate to it. So that's kind of my favourite. I also like things like I Capture the Castle, Lost in Translation, stuff where it's about people, I think, and sort of their journey and the characters. Yeah, with most of those films, not a lot happens, but it's all about, the people and their journey, I guess.
So not kind of big action set pieces.
No, not action or superhero.
Transformers 3 or something like that. Nah. Yeah, robots hitting each other, that sort of thing. But that's actually when I suggested to Jenny doing this this particular film for the podcast. Jenny actually said, "Oh, I'm hoping it's going to be kind of like a Russian Little Women," which I can kind of see how you might come to that conclusion from like the summary. Before we get on to what film we're going to be watching, you've actually been to Russia, haven't you, Jenny?
I have indeed, yeah. In 2003, I went on a school trip. We went to St. Petersburg and Moscow. It was awesome. I really enjoyed it. It was my first time that far east, so it was a real change from the usual Western destinations that I'd been to previously. Mostly because we were in, sixth form. I was just showing Ali my photos, and it's mostly just me and my friends messing around. There's a few, landmarks in there as well, but I don't know if I could tell you a whole lot about the history of the Kremlin and the different art in the museums, but I certainly enjoyed it a lot, and fantastic cities. And actually, the main thing I remember from the trip was the sleeper train between Moscow and St. Petersburg, which felt like something from James Bond. It was amazing, but there was no jaws, so that's good. Yeah,
you don't want a guy with metal teeth chomping you in the neck or something.
Nobody flew out the window or anything.
Yeah, uneventful, which is what you want when you're travelling. But definitely doing that sort of overnight train journey is kind of, I think of as being sort of a rite of passage in terms of travelling within Russia. So it's cool that you got to see two different cities.
Yes, so different as well.
Yeah, do you have a favourite of the two?
I guess I liked St. Petersburg because it was pretty, and it was more reminiscent of, Vienna or Paris or somewhere. It looked very stunning, but Moscow was probably more different because it was so kind of, I don't know, there was such a contrast of rich and poor, and I just remember the coach pulling in to where our hotel was, and there were people sleeping literally in the middle sort of the roads on the roundabouts and stuff, and the cars were all battered, and it all smelt of petrol, and it was completely different. There were people selling crows in cages, and I'd never seen anything like that. So that was really fascinating in terms of a cultural shift for me. Yeah. It was really sort of eye-opening.
Okay. Do you think you'd kind of ever go back?
Oh yeah, I'd love to, because it was such a whistle-stop tour. Yeah. And I was a teenager, so I'd love to go back now and see how it's changed, or just sort of explore it in a bit more depth.
Okay, super. So, moving on to the film that we're going to be watching today. It is called Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears, or Moskva slezam ne verit.
Show off.
Yeah, sorry. I'll kind of have to do that at least once an episode.
Good accent.
So, yes, a certain amount of practice over the years.
Indeed.
So, do you know anything about this film? Had you ever heard about it?
I have to admit, no, I don't. When you first mentioned it, it was the first I'd heard of it. Yeah. So, sadly, to my shame, I'm not up on my Russian film knowledge. So this is me coming in very fresh and, very enthusiastic to discover more about it, for sure.
Cool. Yeah, it's one of those things. If it was a slightly more recent, there's more chance you would have heard of it.
Yeah,
because it was kind of big in its day. It's actually it won the 1980 Best Foreign Film Oscar.
Oh, cool.
So it's not totally obscure, but like 1980 is a while back now. So yeah, and of course, winning an Oscar isn't necessarily indicative of quality. It just means that
it's not shit.
Well, yeah, and the Russian or Soviet authorities thought that this was the one that year they wanted to submit. So they liked it, and then obviously the Americans liked it as well. I kind of think it's interesting that it, being a Soviet film from 1980, that it won, because my recollection as if I was there, my understanding of the history of that point was like the early 80s, there was a bit of a flare-up in the Cold War, so it kind of really has to be doing something special for that sort of film to be winning in that climate. It actually also beat some films from some pretty famous directors that year. There was a Kurosawa film, Kagemusha, was up for the Oscar that year, and there was also a Francois Truffaut film. So it was kind of it sounds like it was quite a competitive field that year. So it
good job.
Quite well. This is actually, for me, the second time I will have seen it. The first time was at Pushkin House, which is like a sort of an NGO in London, in Bloomsbury, where they kind of have various different events kind of promoting Russian culture and sort of, intercultural context. So I was quite lucky to have it sort of introduced by a sort of an academic who studies Russian culture. So that was cool. So that was a couple of years ago, so I don't remember as much about it as ideally I would like. I kind of fancied that I'd taken really detailed notes, but no, I had like half a page. But one interesting detail I did pick up from that was apparently Ronald Reagan watched it something like 8 times before he met Mikhail Gorbachev for the first time.
Okay,
so
weird.
So yeah, well, I think it was just supposed to be like that good as far as providing an insight into Russian culture. So, so I think his thinking or the advice he received was kind of like, if you want to understand the Russian mindset.
They probably gave him a big volume and said, here's Russian history, or you can watch Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears. And he was
8
like,
times.
I'll watch that 8 times.
Yes, please. Yeah. So
he obviously liked it if he kept on watching it.
Indeed, yeah. So, I don't know whether Ronald Reagan is the kind of the best arbiter of film taste, but...
And is he indeed the target audience for this sort of movie? Who knows?
Probably not. But hey, it's at least it
something
seems
for
to have
everyone.
Some universal appeal. Right, so we should probably stop beating around the bush and actually watch the thing.
Yes.
What we do to kind of launch into the film is it's a little gimmick we have.
Oh, here we go.
We say what Yuri Gagarin said when he was blasting off to be the first human in space, and the phrase that he used was "Поехали." So that's what we'll be doing. It's not very exciting. It just means off we go, or we're off. So, but it's kind of like the equivalent of like one small step for man in terms of like how iconic it is.
Nice.
For
Say it
Russians. Again. So yes, "Поехали."
Поехали.
Okay, so we'll do it. 1, 2, 3.
Поехали.
And we're back. So we've just watched Moscow Doesn't Believe in Tears. And Jenny, if you could give a short synopsis of the plot, that would be great.
So, the synopsis. So it starts off with 3 friends. I guess they're early 20s, just out of college. They're living together in a sort of dormitory setup, which is quite unusual for me. I haven't seen that kind of thing in the West, I guess. They seem to be kind of looking for a man, or certainly one of them, Ludmilla, is. And then they're kind of, tackling, finding love and making something of their careers. And then, I guess it's not a big spoiler, but one of the girls falls pregnant, and sort of her life ends up taking a slightly different course to the one she'd predicted for herself. So, is this about right?
Yeah. So that's all good so far.
Yeah, that's
so that's part 1.
Mm-hmm.
And notably, part 1 is set in the 1950s.
Indeed, I just forgot to mention that.
And then we jump forward,
20 years?
It's not quite 20 years, I'd say 15, 16 years, just judging by how old the daughter is.
Mm-hmm.
So we come back, and the daughter has grown up.
And, and Moscow is notably changed. That was quite interesting to see, the city developing and, all that kind of thing too.
Yeah, I wonder how they kind of faked that for the
They must have just chosen different parts of town.
Locations that looked a bit more, less developed. And then where do we kind of pick up from in the second half?
Well, the second half is with Katya, who's the sort of central character, and she's the one that had fallen pregnant in the first part. And she's kind of in a slightly better place than we left her, surprisingly. It sort of ended all quite sort of on a bit of a downer. Yeah. And she was miserable, basically. And then, we check back in with her, and she's done quite well at work. She's sort of like head of something or other. She's some kind of bigwig in the factory.
It's like a factory.
Yeah, so she'd been a sort of factory girl, quite lowly initially, and now she's walking around in what's clearly a fancy suit, sort of having important conversations. And she's got a nice apartment, and life's kind of going well, although is it? It seems like it is, but then she's clearly still quite depressed and not entirely happy. Yeah. And that sort of explores that. And her friends have settled in very different ways. We've got, what was the name of the really quiet girl?
It was Antonina. So she sort of follows a very traditional path. She marries a young man, and they sort of make a joke about how he's so sort of conventional that she might as well have met him in, whichever village that she'd left. Yeah, in fact, it's Lyudmila says, like, why did you come to Moscow? You could have met a guy like him just anywhere. Because they've all clearly sort of come from the provinces and come to Moscow to make the big time and, sort of all this sort of, I guess, this dream of finding riches and finding success in the big city. Yeah. Lyudmila, who was very sort of like carefree and sort of chippy and stuff, she's ended up she's still kind of living in a chaotic way. She's got an ex-husband knocking on the door asking for money, and she's got a fag in her mouth, and she's like all dishevelled when we see her. And so it's kind of interesting to see what's changed and what hasn't, and how their lives have all gone in different trajectories. Cool. Yeah, so that's a good overall summary. Like, what would you say? Sorry, I always do this, and it always sounds patronising. No, not at all. Well done. Yes, excellent, jolly good. I guess first things first. Did you enjoy it? Yeah, I did. Yeah. It was long, and I suppose because I was scribbling notes and reading subtitles, I think I'd probably prefer to go back and watch it again and really soak it in. Because, it kind of whizzes past, and I think there were bits that I missed just by sort of trying to pay too close attention. Sure. But I did like the themes, I liked the characters. Or not all of them. I'm glad I watched it. Okay, well, let's go from there. Which of the characters were you less than fond of? So, I had a real problem with Katya, just because she had so much promise. She seemed really strong. She was clearly intelligent. She wanted to go to college. She sort of was being carried along a little bit by Lyudmila in the sort of quest for a man, but you could tell that she wasn't too concerned about that. Yeah. She seemed kind of like she had it all sorted. But then she still seemed all throughout both parts, even when she was older, very submissive. And that kind of annoyed me. I was like, get a bit of gumption, love, come back and, show a bit of fighting spirit that she clearly had at work, in her home life. Yeah, I was going to say, actually, because in her work life, she's very much, like, calling the shots, and, like, she has guys who are older than her, like quite a bit, reporting to her, and then kind of saying, but we couldn't do it. And she's like, that's no excuse, get on with it, get it done. So I wanted to see a bit more of that in her private life. I was like, come on, you've obviously got this spark, but it kind of, she would look sort of lovingly at these, annoyingly, like, dictatorial men and just be like, you're the best thing in the world, and I was like, no. Yeah, because that's a big point in the second part of the film. What happens with her love life? Yeah. She kind of doesn't have much power and control over that. She sort of is led a lot of the time. In the first part, when she ends up falling pregnant, she's kind of not wanting that to happen, and she's saying no, but she sort of goes ahead with it anyway. Yeah, well, that's actually a big point. Like, it's pretty... What happens to her, how she gets pregnant, it's pretty rapey, I think we can agree. Yeah. It's very non-consensual by today's standards. It's, kind of problematic to watch. But yeah. And it's interesting as well, kind of how it's all thrown back on her. Yeah. She obviously didn't want this to happen. And she tried to say no, but then the fact that she ends up getting pregnant, well, obviously that's all her fault. Yeah. The man had nothing to do with it. So, as a woman, I'm always just like, I can't help but take her part. Sure. Although I don't feel like necessarily the film is saying, like, it was all her fault. She was wearing a low-cut dress, which she wasn't. She wasn't in the film. If you're going to go out in a short skirt, you can expect to be molested on the way home or something. It's not quite like that. No, it isn't. I think a lot of it is Roddy. Well, actually, that's worth mentioning. The guy she initially he has the relationship. He seems like quite a nice guy.
He does, actually. When they first meet, they both seem kind of sweet and quite quiet and just sort of really lovely. And,
and it's not like he randomly attacks her. It's more like...
He's very, he pours her champagne, they're talking, they have a lot in common and it's not too full on. They dance together. It's really sweet.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's just that he gets to the point where he wants to go further. She says, no, and he just doesn't take no for an answer. Yeah. So
but then the worst bit after is the fact that he just literally walks away when he finds out that she's pregnant and she needs some help and she's sort of crying and he's like, well, this is a woman's problem.
Yeah, he literally says that and it's just like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's like, it's nothing to do with me. Yeah. And that's really hard to watch.
Well, and then in the second half, he shows back up.
And he's suddenly interested again.
Yeah, because he has a 16, 17-year-old daughter and he wants to be part of her life.
Yeah.
Well, at this point, I think she does stand up for herself a lot more.
Yes.
Like, she kind of gives him this speech.
She does, actually, to her credit. She tells him, no, you're not going to see her. Where have you been all this time? Like, why are you suddenly interested?
Yeah, like when it was kind of like taking her to school and kind of changing her nappy and all that, you weren't there, and now that she's an adult, you're kind of interested. Like, that's kind of double standard. So there's a little bit of pushback.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. What did you think of Gosha, the new man in her life in the second half? So
he was a really interesting character. I think until him, I did actually feel like kind of a lot of the other characters were a little bit one-dimensional.
Okay.
They were sort of either flighty women or sort of housewifey women, or they were traditionally blokey men, or they were, traditionally douchebaggy men. It was kind of like they were fitting into these clear categories.
Sort of archetypes,
Yes,
but you can almost say that's deliberately done to explore those, maybe.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, that's a very good point. But then, Gosha comes along, and he's really unconventional. And
how so?
Well, so he kind of asserts himself, and sort of... Well, we first meet him on the train.
Randomly.
Really randomly. I think, everything about him is kind of random. And he just... Then the next thing, he's at her apartment, and he pops around for dinner.
Yeah.
And...
Sort of invites himself.
Yeah, exactly. And he hands the daughter like a bag of onions and is like, all right, get chopping. And she's like, who's this guy?
Yeah.
So he sort of just, he's there, and then he's sat at the table chatting to them, and the daughter starts quizzing him, and I think she's quite a cool character.
Yeah, she's very no-nonsense and kind of like...
Typical teenager, just like, kind of doesn't give a shit, but asks quite straightforward questions, which I thought was quite cool.
She's quite grown up in her way.
Yeah.
I mean, you kind of do see her listening to her music and being really into that, but she is kind of like, so who are you?
Yeah, with nothing like me as a 17-year-old, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, she's not rude, but she kind of like... she
seems quite clued up.
Yeah,
maybe the product of having been brought up by a strong professional woman. I don't know.
Right? Yeah, that's probably fair enough.
Yeah, she's been taught to kind of hold her own. Perhaps. Yeah, but she tells Gosha she says to him, "So what are you doing here? Do you want to marry my mum?" And he's like, "Yeah, probably." And it's like, "How long have you known her?" About 48 hours and 20 minutes. He sort of looks at his watch.
Yeah.
And then, he sort of pops off, and it's like, okay, that's kind of random. Who is this intriguing man?
Yeah. I mean, he is very,
What did you make of him,
I think he's very charismatic. I mean, like, I sort of wrote in my notes that he's kind of like Russian Humphrey Bogart. There's something kind of quite... Because he's not, like, conventionally handsome, but he has a certain kind of ruggedness.
Definitely.
It makes it not sound like I fancy him.
He's got a good sort of charisma, a good aura.
And quite a low voice. He even sounds a bit... I mean, obviously speaking Russian, he sounds like the tone of his voice is quite Bogart-y.
Yes.
And he has this kind of like rough and ready, but kind of the way they portray him anyway is like a heart of gold. Like we can kind of dispute that because he's a very conservative guy. Like
he kind of... There are bits where he comes over as caring, and then he sort of... he is very straight down the line, and he has his opinions, and you kind of forgive him because, he makes dinner, which is, I think, quite unusual in Russia at that time, and he, like, tucks her up with a blanket when she's having this picnic. But then there were some absolute alarm bells clanging away, which would just suddenly come out of nowhere when he would sort of shout her down when she was expressing an opinion, and he would just be like, you can't speak to me like that in her own house. Yeah, so I was shouting at the telly like, no, I can't believe he's such a bully. So I just kept being quite conflicted about him.
I mean, it's not like he yell at her. He's very kind of calm, but he's also like straight down the line, like, I will not be spoken to like that.
He puts her in her place, which I found really uncomfortable.
It doesn't feel like they're equal. And he's really insecure because he basically, this is a spoiler alert, but he basically runs off when he finds out, what she actually does.
Yeah, and how much money she earns.
Yeah, because he knows that she's like quite senior, but he has no idea quite how important she is. And then once he finds out, I mean, his pretext is that she lied to him, which technically she was keeping things from him. But you can kind of, from some of the things he says, sometimes half jokingly, but you're never quite sure. He just kind of is very much like, no, I'm the boss around here. What I say goes.
He was quite dictatorial, which was a bit
yes. So and I always think that character's, I don't know, quite a sort of window into how the film in general kind of its outlook. Because I think the film quite likes him. They think that,
they think he's this sort of charismatic hero,
which he is super charismatic. He's quite a cool guy. He's got his flaws, but he is he's not like, I don't know.
Yeah, I think...
now I'm making excuses for which I'm not trying to.
So, the ending was kind of like... seems to sort of set it up as like, it's all worked out well. Because one of the sort of themes it seemed to be, or sort of things they kept alluding to, was not everything works out right away. And this kind of goes back to her future sort of following a slightly different path than she expected. And she doesn't find happiness and happily ever after right away. But then, now she has, with this lovely man that she's waited for. And it was kind of difficult because, the film clearly sets him up as this is the guy she's been waiting for. But as a sort of 21st century female viewer, I had a few questions. And it actually reminded me a bit of My Fair Lady.
Okay.
Because at the end there, he's kind of... I think they have a big argument, but then she comes back to him.
Yeah.
And then he sort of says to her something like, oh, well, pass me my slippers then. And it's like, oh, okay.
I've forgotten about that.
Yeah, because all the while you're rooting for them.
Because in the play that's based on, Pygmalion, George Bernard Shaw. My understanding, I haven't seen it or read it.
I've seen it.
Oh, okay.
And they don't get together.
I was going to say, I thought that they didn't. Sorry, spoiler alert for Pygmalion. I totally ruined that for everyone. I mean, not that anyone reads George Bernard Shaw anymore, I don't think. It is interesting. I mean, I don't know, maybe we're being too harsh on it in the sense of, like, it's a 1980 film.
Yes. And we're putting our modern sensibilities on it.
Yeah, and I think that's totally fair enough to do. I'm just saying that you get films made, probably now, certainly, like, much more recent in the last 5 years that are, equally, like, a woman's not got a life together if she's single.
Well, look at most rom-coms. It's all like, find a man and your life will be complete.
Yeah. I mean, would you call this a rom-com?
That's a really good question, because it is actually very funny. There's some really good laugh-out-loud moments.
Yeah. I mean, you don't want to kind of spoil the joke if people are going to watch it. I mean, but it's quite self-aware. I mean, I think my favourite joke is when there's one of the male characters goes to look for another one and he's sort of knocking on doors.
Yeah.
And because he's very kind of stodgy and straight-laced but still with an air of authority, the person who answers the door it's never said, but it's kind of quite clear that they assume that he's a KGB guy just because of how he's carrying himself.
Yeah.
Which is quite a funny thing just because it's awkward and it's kind of scary.
Yeah.
But also it's funny that it's in a Soviet film from that time that they would make that joke. It's like, and this is pre sort of perestroika, so I'm kind of almost surprised that joke makes it in, possibly because nobody actually says, I think it's the KGB, But I'm glad that you found it funny as well.
Yeah, definitely. It was kind of, self-aware, and also that sort of sense of, because we're watching it retrospectively, it's about an earlier era.
Yeah.
We kind of have that knowledge of the past that enables us to sort of laugh at stuff they say. Like, I think they make a lot about how television is going to change the world.
Yeah, so there were... Yeah, sorry.
No, that's all right. There was, it was, I think, the same bit you were going to say, where the daughter they're talking about how TV is just going to replace movies and books.
Yeah.
And she's like, oh yeah, I can imagine that happening with which way around is it?
Yeah, because it's a return to a previous conversation that you'd had at a dinner table, which we probably should come back to. Because this guy back in the 50s is saying TV is the future.
Yeah.
And one of them says, okay, I can see TV replacing plays. They're on their way out. But, the films and books, they're still going to be a big deal.
Yeah.
And then we jump forward to the 80s. The daughter is having the same conversation with the same guy. And she's saying, well, yeah, theatre, that's always going to be around. Yeah, maybe it will replace films and books.
And we know it obviously doesn't. Yeah, that's quite good.
Yeah, and just for us, TV is kind of... I mean, it's still popular, but it's kind of old hat.
I guess so. Although, I suppose now with Netflix and all this kind of stuff...
Yeah, I suppose...
TV at home is almost replacing movies.
Yeah,
in a way.
But it's much more on your own schedule. It's not like everyone, in the country is going to be watching... I mean, there are probably still some big things that are like that, but there isn't. It's more atomised and more like...
Sure.
People picking up things that they like. Yeah, that was an interesting kind of point to return to, though. Like in the 50s, that in terms of specific scenes that we really liked. Sorry, I should kind of ask you first. Like,
no.
Were there any scenes that you that really stood out for you?
I don't know. I'm going to throw this straight back at you, actually, because you can come at it from a perspective of someone who's lived in Russia and knows a lot more about the political history. So for me, I kind of didn't have any of that background to enrich my appreciation of the film. So how did it appear to you when you were watching the sort of 50s scenes?
Yeah, I think the one really interesting one is there's this dinner party at this really kind of nice apartment. I mean, there's a whole kind of big complicated web of lies that is why this thing is happening there, which is largely because of Ludmilla. We can talk about her a bit more. But yeah, and you have these different guys. Most of them are quite young. Most of them are about the same age as the two, as Ludmilla and Katya. But there's this one older guy who's probably like, mid-40s.
And he's the one that initially says, life begins at 40. And they all laugh.
Everyone is kind of like, right.
Whatever. And then skip forward to when they're 40. And
they're all saying it as well.
Yeah, and they
which is the film,
true.
Another example of the film being deliberately... Yes. Ironical and a bit funny.
Indeed.
So it's not just, some of it is intentional. A lot of it is intentionally funny. Most of the times it's funny, it's because it's trying to be. But anyway, you have this scene and, the 40-year-old guy's kind of saying, the youth nowadays, they mock their elders and it's not cool. And one of the younger guys says, yeah, because... we speak our minds, and you guys, you were silent when you should have said stuff. And they never specifically say what it's about, but because it's the 50s, they're kind of talking about the Stalin era and like the purges and the fact that sort of just people didn't, or at least I'm sure plenty of people did say stuff, but they probably ended up in the gulags themselves. So this 40-year-old guy is kind of like, yeah, no, if you'd been around and been through what I've been through, you'd have done the same. Yeah. Essentially. And the kids are like, no, wouldn't.
And it's an interesting period because I think they're just coming out of that now, aren't they, in the late 50s?
Yeah, in the late 50s. So things had loosened up. Stalin died in 53, and then you had Khrushchev, who was, quite a flawed leader as well, but he deliberately, distanced the government from how things had been done and trying to do things differently. I mean, it was still essentially a dictatorship, but it was less kind of cult of personality-ish. And, a lot of people were sort of released from the gulags and rehabilitated, and just they kind of tried to draw a line under things. Yeah,
there was a sense in the movie of sort of Moscow changing.
Yeah.
And the new generations... coming up and changing things. Yeah, that sort of East versus West theme was kind of interesting to me, and I think would probably have more impact on you. Like, how did you feel about that? There were bits that were showing canned goods and Western music. What did that mean to you?
I think I don't know. I don't think it was particularly saying sort of strong things about the kind of the Cold War. I think it was really mostly focused on how things were in Russia, but there were kind of little sort of signifiers of like people's level within society. It's supposed to be very egalitarian, but a lot is made of like how nice this apartment that they're staying in the first half is because of some of the stuff they have around.
There's a real obsession with wealth, I thought, and kind of status.
Yeah,
and
which
the
is
girls
funny
are very aspirational.
Yeah, although they're aspirational in very different ways, I would say, because
True.
Antonina kind of wants things to be just quite straightforward.
Traditional.
Yeah.
She could almost exist in any time.
Yeah. Whereas Katya is kind of like, I will work hard and I will kind of earn my position in society.
Although she still just wants to kind of land a wealthy husband.
Would you say that? Or would you say that's more how she is in the second half?
Again, it's hard to tell with her because she says some things in such a jokey way.
Yeah.
You almost don't know whether there's a bit of truth in that or whether she's just taking the mick. Like she'll say, the best place to catch a husband is, go to a graveyard and you'll find a wealthy widow.
But that's Luda though.
Oh. Is that the wrong one?
Yeah, Luda is the...
Oh, I was thinking of her.
Yeah, Katya is kind of like the more like main...
Yes, sorry, no, she is she is more focused on her career, of course. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, whereas... Luda is, as you say, kind of always joking about, and I think she is being quite jokey. She sometimes shows self-awareness, but she is essentially thinking that, the way to success is marry the right guy. Yeah,
completely.
I mean, she's really judgmental of Antonina for that reason, like we've already said.
For just settling with some sort of stodgy, boring country guy.
Yeah. Well, you were kind of surprised by how things ended up, at least with the two of those at the end of part one.
Yeah, so my initial feeling for the way sort of Katya was being set... No, Ludmilla.
Yeah, sorry, I'm changing between the
no, that's
nickname.
Me.
Yeah,
not up on my Russian names. Yeah, Ludmilla. The way she was sort of set up, she seemed like a bit of a Rizzo character, like she was going to get herself in trouble. But then it actually turns out that it's her more straight-laced friend.
Yeah.
So I thought that was quite good in terms of not being predictable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very sort of deliberate, dramatic twist. The thing, I don't know whether this is even worth mentioning, but the thing about Ludmilla is she kind of reminded me of Lydia
Bennett
in Pride and Prejudice.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think a lot of it's the similarity of the names, but also they're quite similar personalities. It's
the
very
jokey sort of, but slightly like, you really need to be careful sort of thing.
Don't do stupid things, and it's kind of like officers.
Chasing after the exactly.
Yeah.
And then the bit when Lydia sort of like leaves that note when she's eloped, she's like, "You will laugh when you hear where I've gone to," and everyone's like, "Oh, it's not a joke, Lydia."
Yeah.
So there was a sense that she might end up a bit like that, but she doesn't.
Yeah, I suppose this is where this is kind of less conventional. Although,
or does she?
By the time we get to the second half, things are not.
She looks in kind of a mess, and things haven't worked out so well for her.
Yeah, I mean, she talks about Moscow being like a lottery, and I'm going to win the jackpot, and it looks like she has because at the end of the first half,
she's engaged. She's is he a?
He's an ice hockey player.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, he's quite successful.
Sporting hero.
Yeah. So then that doesn't work out quite as well.
Yeah.
What did you think as far as like the filmmaking is concerned? I mean, we talked a lot about the plot and the intricacies and detail. Would you... Yeah.
I thought it was really well done.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of... it's really well shot and... Everything seems to have a meaning, like nothing is throwaway, even though it's a good sort of 2.5 hours or even more, perhaps.
Yeah, about 2.5, I would say.
Yeah, it's real rich content. Nothing feels like it's done for the sake of it. There's some, nice lighting and sort of the sets are really good. You get a good sense of place. I often think when I'm watching a film from, I don't know, the 80s or whatever, which is portraying the 50s, they always do such a terrible job of it because the 50s just looks like the 80s.
Yeah.
It was ages before I realised that Dirty Dancing was actually supposed to be set in the 50s because I just assumed it was an 80s movie with all the music and the hairstyles and the perms.
Yeah.
And the leotards. But, no, they do a really good job of that. And it feels like it's got a lot of substance, and it's been well thought of and well crafted. Would you agree?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, I think it's not a very flashy film. Like,
no.
you get the impression it's kind of very like, okay, well, we'll do the things that we, but there's not like particularly like, as I say, flashy camera work or weird angles or. Yeah, it's just it feels
quite,
unfussy.
it feels quite realistic. And even the fact that the actors and actresses are kind of, none of them are supermodel gorgeous.
Yeah.
They're kind of normal looking.
Yeah.
And they live in sort of normal looking places. It feels quite real.
Yeah. That's always the nice thing about watching a film with actors that you're not particularly familiar with.
That's true.
I mean, I think the chap who plays Gosha was quite famous in Russia, so maybe we wouldn't get that so much if they were watching. Oh yeah, it's
Yeah, but as you said, he's not sort of conventionally stud muffin handsome.
Yeah,
So.
And I mean, Katya is quite attractive, but she isn't kind of like,
she's not like Keira Knightley gorgeous, and she's meant to be this kind of average looking woman or something.
And especially Keira Knightley working at that factory, you'd kind of like, your arm's gonna snap there. So I thought it was like visually fairly unremarkable, but in some ways that was good. I think because it's a drama, it's so focused on characters. If you kind of do flashy stuff, it's gonna sort of distract, I think.
There was a good scene actually where a couple of good scenes, and one of them was where she was sitting on the bench just after she'd spoken to Rudy, this is Katya, and told him about, she's in this predicament, she's about to have a baby that she doesn't want, there's no other way out, and he just kind of leaves her and shrugs his shoulders and walks away, and they
Not my problem.
And they sort of leave her and slowly pan, and it's not in a hammy way, but it's quite noticeable that she's sitting alone on this bench, and people are sort of carrying on their lives but around her. And that sense of isolation is quite well brought out through the cinematography.
And then they kind of do a callback, because when you meet when they meet up again in the second half, it's in exactly the same place. That's good attention to detail.
And also with when the baby arrives, there's a kind of real good bustling scene where they all have dinner, and her friends come back, and they're chatting, and everyone's fussing, and they're having this noisy sort of jolly dinner, and then the immediate scene after that is a complete contrast where she's alone in her room, and the mood is so different, and she's clearly not happy. And I thought that was quite a good contrast there.
That was one of two really nice juxtapositions they did. The other one earlier on, in the first half, is they go to this French film festival.
Oh yeah.
And they're sort of in the crowd, and it's really quite glamorous. You have all these famous people, and they're going, "Oh look, it's so and so, it's so and so." And then immediately after, it cuts to a scene of Katya working on the factory shop floor, and it's kind of like, she's in her overalls and kind
back to reality.
Yeah, it's a nice juxtaposition as well. So I thought that was particularly good. I mean, any criticisms that you have? I mean, besides the kind of questionable gender politics we've already sort of covered.
I don't know really. I think that was kind of the main thing. That was the overriding theme for me that was coming out. And I kind of had a question for you, actually. How do you feel as a bloke? Like, were there any sympathetic male characters? Because to me, it seemed like they were mostly portrayed as goofy husbands, all kind of down the pub getting drunk, whereas the women were sort of making something of their lives. And there was some sort of comment, I think, when they were talking about, if you go to any art gallery today, it's all women, because, there's only women there that are interested in culture.
The guys are just, just down the pub or watching TV.
Yeah, so the film's portrayal of men isn't that good, I thought. I don't know what you thought.
I mean, again, going back to Gosha, the sort of, hero of the second half, I think he's the film loves him. And there are, like, genuinely admirable things about him. I mean, the fact that he's not that fussed about status, but he isn't a schlub either.
That's true.
Because he has his good friends, and he's just not that bothered about status, but he has found a job that he likes and is really, really good at.
Yeah.
It's not like, he's just, he can't be bothered, and he's just doing something that he hates and just crap at.
Because there are some men that are just following this executive dream, and it all seems a bit empty and vacuous.
They're not doing it because that's what they want. They're doing it because that's sort of the way to get on. I mean,
the status that comes with it and all that kind of thing, yeah.
Well, going back to Rudolph, and actually sort of following on from that, in the first half he's called Rudolph, and in the second he's changed his name to Rodion, which is a much more kind of stereotypically Russian name. And the kind of implication of that is that he's sort of done that to fit in, and they even say, you know, during the dialogue that you kind of came across a lot more foreign names when we were younger.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a nod to that being, you know, very. That's sort of a signifier about the character. Another thing I really liked about it was just how many kind of Russian cultural details they had.
Yeah.
But none of them particularly felt shoehorned in. It was always this is happening because this would just happen as you're going about your business. It's not like they've deliberately kind of engineered. Sure. Yeah.
And the difference there would be, because this is a Russian-made film, they would have no need to. Whereas if it was made by Hollywood, they would probably be like shoving in some like really cheesy Russian stereotypes which didn't sit well at all.
Sure.
But I guess it feels more genuine, does it?
Or if it was a more art house film, kind of going, okay, we're going to now have this happen, even though it's not really important to the plot, just to show that we've done our research and we know about this thing that they do.
What were the examples of things?
One of the big ones was there's a bit where some of the characters are going on a journey, and so they're all packed and they're just about to head out the door, and they all sort of take a seat. And that's something that is traditionally, you know, just done, especially if it's a significant journey. It's not like every time you go out to work, you have to stop before you... But if you're going a significant distance, and it's just it's like I don't know, it sounds harsh to call it a superstition. It's just a kind of a cultural thing. That's what you do.
That's really cool, because I had no idea about that, so that was good for me.
And the other thing is you have a wedding scene, and during the wedding, all of the guests shout out Gorka, Gorka, and Gorka is the Russian word for bitter. And so what happens then is everyone shouts bitter, and this means that the bride and groom have to kiss to make things sweet again. In fact, I think there's a little bit where in the dialogue where you kind of feel like, that's probably been put in for the benefit of non-Russian audiences.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, because someone says, you have to make it sweet again.
Right. Like, a little bit of exposition.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, that's an interesting point, because I haven't really talked about my criticisms.
Go for it.
Besides, the gender thing. Again, we keep talking about it. I'm obviously really self-conscious about making sure... Yes, I'm an enlightened modern bloke.
He is, listeners, don't worry.
Yes, thanks. Mostly dialogue is really good, but there is one bit right at the beginning of the second half where it does feel a bit like you're having this one character. It's the dance club organizer that Katya is, and she's kind of just reeling off all of these things. And it's basically she's just going through all the problems of, you know, late 70s, early 80s Soviet society.
Yeah, for the benefit of the viewer.
Yeah. So that felt a little bit shoehorned, maybe, but that was the kind of the main thing that I had from the sort of the negative point of view.
Talking about enlightened blokes, it was really interesting hearing you chatting with your wife earlier about how. Even nowadays, it was quite unusual for a bloke to be doing the washing up or something. Because for me, I was sort of bringing at the point like, it's weird that, you know, he seems like this enlightened modern man, this Gosha fella. Who doesn't seem that enlightened to me, but your point was, well, you know, he does make dinner for them.
He pitches in.
Yeah, which would be quite unusual. And even now.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is there's kind of been a bit of a reaction in Russia against feminism, because... the Soviet Union ideologically really pushed women's equality, but there was kind of a double edge to it, because it was kind of like, well, we want you in the workforce so our economy will be more productive.
Okay.
But and they did provide, you know, quite generous sort of child support, and, you know, it did want people to be in the workforce. On the other hand, there was kind of, at least the impression I get, the unspoken assumption that women would still do all the traditional homemaking, you know, quote-unquote duties on top of that, as well as being a worker. So it's kind of like... And
that's still kind of a hangover today.
Yeah, well, and you have some women saying now in Russia, yeah, we had feminism, we had equality, it wasn't that good. We want to go back to sort of traditional gender roles because then at least, we can stay at home and not have to go out to work as well. I mean, that's not like representative of women in general in Russia, but there is that kind of section within society that is kind of like, yeah, feminism didn't work out that well for us.
That's really interesting.
I guess
whereas here it's kind of had a renaissance where it's kind of moved on from this sort of typical shouty 70s feminism where everyone's burning their bras, and now it seems more kind of ingratiated and just kind of acceptable, and men are feminists and everyone's a feminist. It's just kind of, I don't know, it's kind of changed in a different way here, perhaps.
Like maybe less sort of self-consciously, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know where this tangent's going.
No, yeah.
I had one more question for you. As a former Russian dweller, how did Moscow appear to you in the film compared to
good point.
the Moscow that you know?
Yeah, we did talk about this while we were watching it. A lot less busy.
Okay.
I mean,
you commented on the roads, didn't you?
Yeah, that was the big thing, the traffic, because actually one of the signifiers really early on in part 2 that Katya's kind of made it is that she has her own car. Yeah. Which it was hard to get hold of. Sure. Even by the early 80s, people did have cars. It's just now tons of people have it. And also, I think population in modern Russia is really concentrated in Moscow. I think back in the Soviet era, there was a bit more of an effort to kind of spread the industry out around the country, and actually it was quite difficult just to move to Moscow. In fact, that's one of the themes of the film is that people are trying to get stable jobs so that they can stay. Yeah. It's like
the streets of Moscow is sort of paved with gold, it seems, and they're all kind of heading for that.
Yeah, so it's still aspirational now. It's just a bit easier to move there, and also there isn't necessarily the government support for industries elsewhere kind of causing people to move to the other big cities in the way that they now move to Moscow. So yeah, definitely the roads are are very different. Obviously,
certainly what I remember from my fleeting visit all those years ago was the crazy traffic. It was just mad and really sort of people were just going all over the place. And I remember the teachers sort of like being quite cautious about whenever we had to cross a road because they were sort of counting us, make sure that everyone got over.
Driving there, I mean, it's not always fabulous here, but it was
Did you drive there?
No, I never drove there.
I was going to say.
No, I mean, I'm not a nervous passenger in this country. I hated being in a car in Moscow just because people...
White knuckles!
A bit, yeah. People are very keen to get where they're going, and the traffic laws seem more of a suggestion there.
More of a guideline than a
rule.
Guideline
than a rule, to quote Jack Sparrow.
I was just going to say that was a Pirates of the Caribbean quote, which might be lost on people.
Unwittingly,
There are more guidelines.
Quality stuff. Speaking of Keira Knightley as well.
Indeed.
Just come up again. I think that was basically all that I had, really. I mean, there was kind of a nice little reference in the earlier part to a poet that I've subsequently heard of since the last film that I talked about. They talk about a poet called Yevtushenko being like really promising. Yeah, and it turned out this year he just died. So it's kind of initially we were kind of going, are these actors they're talking about real people? We didn't necessarily know, but certainly some of the characters or people they referenced were actually real. So they haven't just kind of made that up.
Yeah, and clearly, people or Russian viewers watching this would know that this guy obviously did become a big deal. Yeah. So it's kind of funny to hear them say, he seems quite promising.
Yeah, dramatic irony. Yeah, it's like, indeed. Look how foresighted they were. Yeah, I mean, definitely going back to the positive and the good side of it, I can definitely see now why Ronald Reagan might have watched this film as many times, just in terms of how it does provide insight.
And there's so much in it as well. Like I said, another viewing would probably be quite good in terms of getting all the bits that I missed. And there's lots of detail in there. Yeah, it's very substantial.
Yeah, it's definitely has a certain staying power. Actually, there was one more thing I wanted to mention. We talked about the stereotypes. It was the bit where you have two male characters sorting out a squabble over copious amounts of alcohol.
Oh, yeah.
They're sort of, you know...
It couldn't be a Russian film without some vodka in it.
Yeah, but on the other hand, if you had a film set in Russia and you have that scene and that problem being decided that way, I would probably go, oh, for goodness sake, this is just being a bit...
They're going to start Cossack dancing in a moment.
Yeah, this is a bit racist.
It's a little bit Fiddler on the Roof.
It's kind of like, they're sort of self-consciously taking the mickey there, which is always nice to see, you know, when a country feels sufficiently...
We know this is how we're viewed, kind of thing.
Yeah. Or maybe there is a certain amount of truth to, perhaps we actually do, some of us do actually do this.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. There was, before we kind of round things up, there was a little sort of question I wanted to ask as far as your sort of journalistic experience. One of the funny scenes, it's quite a crucial scene, but there's sort of like a comic sub-element to it. You have, this is still in part one, Katya is working at the factory, and this sort of local news want to do a story about how she's this woman who's doing really well in the factory, and they kind of want to show this to kind of inspire other people. And you have this journalist kind of presenter coming on, going to interview Katya, and it seems like it's going to be very straight down the line and like, oh yes, it's quite inspiring. But Katya is then really, really forthright, and she says some stuff about, you know, how
the pay is
rubbish, and she's just really outspoken.
Yeah.
And you just kind of get the expression on the presenter's face like, that's not how I was expecting this to go.
Yeah, totally.
I just wonder, had you ever done an interview when you kind of, it really surprised you and, that is not how I saw this going?
That's such a good question. So, no, I don't think so, because interviews do tend to go exactly predictably how you're going to think, because the people you're interviewing, the people I spoke to were generally kind of, let's say, D to C list celebrities. They were generally in town for Panto or something. Yeah. So I'd speak to them down the phone or maybe at a hotel room or something. And it was all very formulaic. You know, you'd sort of... You got the impression that they had anticipated every question. Sure. They answered them all 100 times, and they had a kind of script almost. Yeah. So they'd done all these press conferences before. Yeah. So you'd try and throw in a kind of a different answer, but then often they would just kind of steer that back to a very generic
talking point, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I was like, I was trying to ask you about your favourite cheese, but you just told me how wonderful the play is. They do tend to go exactly how you predict them to be.
Actually, I was going to say, like, as far as the celebrities thing, I guess if it is more sort of B-list, C and below, you don't have people being such a big star that they can kind of say whatever they want.
Yeah, exactly.
And just be like, whatever. But yeah, anyway, so generally, it sounds like you've enjoyed it. Would you recommend this to other people?
Yeah, I would. I would. I'd say, like Mr. Reagan, it's a good insight into... Russia at that sort of era. Sure. It's really fascinating to get that insight. You know, not everyone has lived there and, you know, experienced that or has that kind of knowledge perhaps. Sure. That was really good to see. And the characters are great. There's a lot of humour. Yeah, I would recommend it.
But sort of as a follow-on to that, do you think, as you said, it's very useful kind of as a sort of, you know, almost like a cultural artefact? But do you think it has a more sort of, it sounds pretentious, but more universal appeal?
It does. I mean, the themes, of course, are completely universal. Yeah. They're all about, you know, what life throws at you, really. Yeah. And in that way, it is kind of a bit like Little Women. It's, you know, three friends that start off from a similar point, but then sort of separate off in their different ways. And they go through, you know, they're talking about love and they're talking about career and family. And there's a bit where they're all sort of sitting on the steps after this sort of dinner and they're talking about how, you know, their parents are getting a bit old now. And it's, so that there are these conversations that people will have today. Yeah. They will have had 100 years ago and they will be having in 100 years to come. So, definitely universal themes prevail.
Okay, so, check it out. Thanks very much, Jenny, for joining me.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah, I'm glad that it hasn't been a total dud of a film.
Well...
Just gone, I'll never do this again. Yeah.
Well, that's 3 hours I'll never get back.
Yeah, indeed.
No, it's very good.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much. And I meant to ask you about this. If people would like to hear more from you, are you on social media?
Oh, yes, I am. I'm at Jenny Shelton Cam on Twitter. That's probably the best way to find me. I'm generally talking about birds or period dramas.
Yeah, okay.
One of those three things.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to have you on for like a 19th century literary adaptation next
Oh, yes,
time.
please.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much for listening, and до свидания.
Goodbye.
Не сразу все устроилось, Москва не сразу строилась, слова...
So that's it for this episode, but before I go, I'd like to thank Sasha Ilukovich and the Highly Skilled Migrants for the use of their song Cold in our intro. You can find that song and the rest of their back catalogue on Bandcamp and Spotify. If you're enjoying the show, please consider supporting us by leaving a rating at Apple Podcasts or at podchaser.com. That second one, Podchaser, even lets you rate individual episodes, so if this episode particularly stood out to you, you can let other listeners know that you enjoyed it. Recommending the show on social media is hugely helpful as well. If you can spare a moment or two to do that, it would really make my day. Thank you very much. Speaking of social media, please find us and say hi on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram. You can also drop us a line at rusfilesunite@gmail.com. Oh yeah, and don't forget to check out World Film Locations Moscow from Intellect Books. Thanks again for listening, take care of yourselves, and bye for now.
Что вся в листву оденется, Москва найдет для дельца хоть краешек земли. Александра, Александра, что там бьется перед нами? Это ясень семенами крутит вальс над мостовой. Ясень с видом деревенским приобщился к вальсам венским. Он пробьется, Александра, он надышится Москвой.